Thousands of years ago, people didn't fear salt. They fought over it. Governments taxed it. Trade routes were built around it. It preserved food before refrigerators existed. And in 1930, one of the most famous political protests in history centered around salt. Yet today, walk into almost any doctor's office with high blood pressure, and you may hear, cut back on the salt. So how did one of the most valuable substances in human history become something we're afraid to sprinkle on dinner? And here's where this story gets even stranger. Your body cannot survive without sodium, but too much can absolutely raise blood pressure in some people. And two people can eat the same amount and respond completely differently. Today we're putting salt under the microscope. And stay with me, because by the end, we're going to answer 3 questions. Is salt really dangerous? Does everyone need to restrict it? And why might someone eating keto or carnivore experience salt very differently? If you're new to this series, Food Under the Microscope is where we take foods we've been told are good, bad, dangerous, or miraculous, and investigate their history, the science, and what actually happens inside the human body. We've already put bacon, coffee, eggs, butter, and cheese under the microscope. I'll share links to all of those videos in the description. And if you're enjoying this series, do me a favor, hype this video, which you can do in some cases after you hit the like button. Share it with somebody who thinks salt is either poison or a nutritional superfood. And tell me in the comments what food we should investigate next. Because salt deserves something better than another internet food fight. It deserves context. And that context begins thousands of years ago. Before refrigeration, salt wasn't simply seasoning. It was technology. Salt reduces the water available to microorganisms, making it harder for many of them to grow. That meant meat, fish, and other foods could survive longer. Food could travel. Armies could travel. Civilizations could store food. And salt became power. Ancient China developed extensive salt production. And governments discovered something governments have never forgotten. If everybody needs something, you can tax it. Salt taxes became enormously valuable sources of revenue. Venice built wealth partly through controlling salt trade. And France imposed the infamous gabelle, a salt tax so hated that resentment surrounding it became part of the political landscape leading toward the French Revolution. Think about that. Today we might complain about the price of groceries. Imagine getting angry enough about the price of salt to help overthrow a monarchy. But perhaps the most famous salt protest came later. India. Britain controlled salt production and imposed a salt tax. Gandhi decided to challenge it. He walked roughly 240 miles to the Arabian Sea in what became known as the Salt March. Thousands followed him. At the coast, Gandhi defied British law by making salt. Literally, something you sprinkle on your eggs became an instrument of civil disobedience. That's how important salt was. And here's a fun myth worth correcting. You've probably heard Roman soldiers were literally paid in salt. And that's where our word salary comes from. There's a historical connection between the Latin sal, meaning salt, and salarium, which eventually gives us salary. But the popular story that Roman soldiers routinely received wages in bags of salt, that's much shakier historically. So no, you probably shouldn't picture a Roman soldier paying payroll, hearing something like direct deposit or Himalayan pink. But salt really was extraordinarily valuable. And there's a biological reason. Sodium helps maintain fluid balance and blood volume. Your nerves depend on sodium gradients to generate electrical impulses. Your muscles, including your heart, depend on electrolyte gradients to function. And your kidneys constantly regulate sodium. Your body treats sodium less like an optional seasoning and more like a controlled biological resource. When sodium or circulating volume falls, your kidneys activate systems including the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, or RAS. Aldosterone essentially tells the kidneys, hold on to sodium. Water follows. Blood volume is supported. Your body is constantly adjusting the system. Which brings us to the question that probably brought many of you here. Does salt cause high blood pressure? The answer is sometimes. And that word matters. In the landmark DASH sodium trial, Researchers tightly controlled what more than 400 people ate and tested different sodium levels. Lower sodium lowered blood pressure, and the effect was particularly meaningful in people with hypertension. So let's be clear, the claim that sodium has nothing to do with blood pressure is not supported by the evidence. It does, but here's what often gets lost. We don't all respond equally. Some people are much more salt sensitive than others. Salt sensitivity is more common in people with hypertension and tends to increase with age. Kidney disease, metabolic dysfunction, genetics, medications, and other factors can also influence the response. And this is where my root cause brain kicks in, because there's another question I don't think we ask often enough. Is salt always the underlying problem? Or is salt sometimes exposing an underlying problem? Think about insulin resistance. Chronically elevated insulin can encourage the kidneys to retain sodium. Insulin resistance is also associated with increased sympathetic nervous system activity, altered vascular function, inflammation, and other changes that can contribute to hypertension. Now add more sodium. Where sodium goes, water tends to follow. That can increase circulating volume. And if you're already dealing with blood vessels that don't dilate normally, or kidneys that aren't handling sodium efficiently, that additional volume may produce a very different blood pressure response. So yes, reducing sodium can lower blood pressure. That's real. But I don't want us to stop there. I also want to ask, why is this person salt sensitive in the first place? Is it kidney disease, insulin resistance, excess aldosterone, sleep apnea, chronic stress, medication, genetics, low potassium, or several of these happening together? For some metabolically unhealthy patients, I'm not only looking at the salt shaker, I'm looking at excessive refined starches and sugars that may contribute to chronically elevated insulin. I'm looking at sleep, stress, movement, body composition, kidney function, and the overall dietary pattern. Because sometimes lowering sodium may help control the pressure, while improving metabolic health helps address some of the physiology, contributing to why that pressure became elevated in the first place. Maybe two people don't respond differently to salt simply because one ate too much. Maybe they're bringing two completely different metabolic environments to the same salt shaker. And now we hit one of the biggest controversies. Some observational studies, including analysis from the large international PURE study, have reported what looks like a J-shaped relationship. Very high estimated sodium intake was associated with greater cardiovascular risk, but very low estimated intake sometimes was too. Does that prove low sodium is dangerous? No. People who are already sick may eat less. Long-term sodium intake is difficult to measure, and some studies estimate intake using spot urine samples, which can introduce substantial error. So the low sodium side of that J-curve remains controversial. And keep in mind, science isn't improved by pretending uncertainty doesn't exist. Now my keto and carnivore audience should pay close attention. Remember what we just discussed about insulin and sodium retention? Watch what can happen when we move in the opposite direction. When insulin falls during fasting or significant carbohydrate restriction, the kidneys can excrete more sodium. Water follows sodium. That's one reason people can lose several pounds rapidly when beginning a ketogenic diet. Congratulations! Some of that dramatic first week weight loss was your bathroom. And speaking of electrolytes, this video is sponsored by Keto Chow. I've used Keto Chow's electrolyte products myself, and I tend to use their electrolyte capsules. One reason I like thinking beyond sodium alone is that electrolytes work together, and Keto Chow offers options that include sodium, potassium, and magnesium. I'll put my affiliate link in the description if you'd like to check them out. Now let's get right back to the science. Because how much sodium might somebody eating keto actually need? Dr. Stephen Phinney, one of the pioneers of modern low-carbohydrate research, and his colleagues at Virta Health have generally recommended roughly 3 to 5 grams of sodium per day as an average range for people following a well-formulated ketogenic diet. But listen carefully. That's sodium, not salt. 5 grams of sodium is roughly 12 grams of salt, and that's considerably higher than standard population recommendations. So I'm not telling everybody watching this who's keto or carnivore to start consuming 5 grams of sodium. There is older experimental ketogenic research supporting increased mineral replacement during carbohydrate restriction. And the physiology of increased sodium loss with carbohydrate restriction makes sense. But we do not have definitive long-term trials establishing one perfect sodium target for every person eating keto. And we certainly don't have evidence establishing a universal 7-gram sodium requirement for carnivores. This needs to be individualized. If I have someone sitting in front of me who is ketogenic, their kidney function is normal. They're not retaining fluid. Their blood pressure is normal or low. And they're telling me they're lightheaded, fatigued, cramping, or feeling terrible after substantially restricting carbohydrates. I'm absolutely thinking about sodium and electrolytes. But if that same person has uncontrolled hypertension, chronic kidney disease, heart failure, or they're taking a diuretic or certain blood pressure medications, that's an entirely different conversation. And potassium supplementation requires particular caution with kidney disease and medications that can increase potassium. This is why I keep coming back to the same idea. Don't treat a number, understand the physiology. And that brings us to sodium's partner that doesn't get nearly enough attention, potassium. Think of sodium and potassium as dance partners. We spend enormous amounts of time yelling at sodium while barely noticing what potassium is doing. Higher potassium intake can promote sodium excretion and help lower blood pressure. And one fascinating randomized trial involved nearly 21,000 people in rural China at elevated cardiovascular risk. Researchers replaced regular salt with a substitute containing less sodium chloride and more potassium chloride. The result, fewer strokes, fewer major cardiovascular events, and fewer deaths. But remember, the intervention changed two things: less sodium and more potassium. Sometimes nutrition isn't about eliminating the villain. It's about restoring the balance. Now let me destroy another little marketing fantasy. Himalayan pink salt, sea salt, kosher salt, table salt. Your kidneys are not impressed by the packaging. They differ in crystal size, processing, flavor, and trace minerals. Sodium per teaspoon can differ because differently sized crystals pack differently. But gram for gram, these salts are predominantly sodium chloride. Those beautiful trace minerals in expensive pink salt, they're present in amounts far too small to transform your salt into a multivitamin. But ordinary iodized table salt has one advantage we've almost forgotten: iodine. And this brings us back to history. In the early 1900s, parts of America became known as the Gorder Belt. Iodine deficiency was widespread. In 1924, iodized salt was introduced commercially in the United States, beginning prominently in Michigan. Over the following years, rates of enlarged thyroid glands fell dramatically. Think about the irony. We took salt, added a micronutrient, and helped address a major public health problem. Today, many people have replaced iodized salt with gourmet salts that may contain little or no iodine. That doesn't automatically create deficiency. Iodine can come from seafood, dairy, eggs, and other sources, but it's worth remembering. And now perhaps the biggest twist in the modern salt story. Most Americans aren't getting most of their sodium from the salt shaker. More than 70% comes from packaged, prepared, and restaurant foods. That changes the conversation. Maybe the problem isn't simply someone salting a steak. Maybe we need to examine the entire dietary pattern. Highly processed foods can deliver sodium alongside refined carbohydrates, excess calories, and foods designed to make overeating remarkably easy. That's a different metabolic environment from salting minimally processed foods to taste. It doesn't make sodium irrelevant. It makes context relevant. The World Health Organization recommends less than about 2,000 milligrams of sodium per day, while US guidance generally uses 2,300 milligrams as the daily limit. Those population recommendations exist for good reason. Excessive sodium can raise blood pressure. But when I'm sitting across from an individual patient, I'm also asking, what's your blood pressure? What's your kidney function? What medications are you taking? Are you insulin resistant? Are you eating mostly processed food? Are you ketogenic? Are you exercising and sweating heavily? How much potassium are you getting? Are you sleeping? What's happening with stress? In other words, don't treat the salt shaker before you understand the person holding it. That's root cause medicine. So after putting salt under the microscope, here's where I land. Salt is neither poison nor a miracle mineral. It's an essential nutrient with a dose, a context, and a person attached to it. Too much can absolutely raise blood pressure, especially in salt-sensitive people. But if someone is salt-sensitive, I also want to understand why. Potassium matters. Kidney function matters. Insulin resistance matters. Sleep and stress matters. Metabolic health matters. And dramatically reducing carbohydrates can change sodium handling enough that some people notice it almost immediately. The lesson isn't fear salt, and it isn't eat unlimited salt. The lesson is understand your physiology. That's the purpose of Food Under the Microscope. Not to tell you what to think, but to give you enough information to think better. And if this episode changed the way you look at that salt shaker, hype the video, like it, share it, and comment below. What food should I put under the microscope next? I'll put links to the previous episodes on bacon, coffee, eggs, butter, and cheese in the description. And for more of my work, resources, videos, books, and metabolic health information, visit TonyHamptonMD.com. Until next time, protect your nest, use your rope, and remember, sometimes the most ordinary thing sitting on the kitchen table has an extraordinary story hiding inside of it.